All right, in this screencast, we're going to talk. Okay, first of all, we have to define a couple of words, two words that you might be familiar with. Producers, also known as autotrophs. The prefix auto means self and troph means feeding. That means that they can feed themselves because they manufacture their own food. They don't have to eat. The producers and autotrophs are plants. You need to understand that plants. There are sometimes so it says most producers use photosynthesis, energy from the sun. There are some autotrophic bacteria, so they wouldn't be plants, that use a process called chemosynthesis. Instead of getting energy from the sun, they're getting energy from chemicals in the environment. Autotrophic bacteria often are found in extreme environments where the archaebacteria are found, like in the volcanic vents at the bottom of the ocean, for example. So one more time, producers and autotrophs manufacture their own food. They don't eat. Most producers are plants that we find on the surface of the sun. They're collecting sunlight and turning it into sugar that they use themselves. Autotrophic bacteria are also examples of producers. Okay, in reference to producers and the amount of action that's happening in a given environment, there's the word biomass. Biomass is simply the mass of organic or living material in the environment. The net primary productivity is defined as the rate at which energy is turned into food. Now that's basically how many producers there are, how active that environment is. It's how much photosynthesis or chemosynthesis is occurring in a given environment. So if you think about this, which ecosystem should have the greatest net primary productivity? Again, it's the rate at which energy is turned into food. So it would be the ecosystems that have the most producers. Which would those be? All right, in the graph, we're taking a look at the primary productivity of different ecosystems, and the two that produce by far the most are estuaries and tropical rainforests. Deserts are by far the lowest because there's not many producers. Interestingly, the open ocean doesn't have many producers in it either. Here's a bonus point question for people who live in Minnesota. Most of us don't know what an estuary is because there's not estuaries in Minnesota. I'm not going to take too much time to let you think. An estuary is where fresh water mixes with salt water. So for example, at the base of the Mississippi, at the mouth of the Mississippi down in Louisiana, where it's dumping into the Gulf of Mexico, that's a giant estuary. Estuaries are extremely productive and fragile ecosystems. All right, enough about the producers and the autotrophs. Let's move on to the consumers. They consume. They're also called heterotrophs. The prefix hetero means other or different than, and troph means to feed again. So they're feeding on others. These guys obtain energy by eating. Remember, the producers make their own food through photosynthesis or chemosynthesis. Consumers or heterotrophs have to eat others. There's 4 or 5 main categories of consumers, and some of these should be really familiar. You may have learned these even in elementary school. First of all, the organisms that eat just producers, and we're not talking about vegetarians, although that's also true. They have a more scientific name. The scientific name is herbivores. So now that you know that one, you probably know the next one. Animals that just eat other consumers are called carnivores, although lions are sometimes also in another category, which we'll talk about in just a second. And then organisms that eat both producers and consumers would be considered omnivores. So here's a question: what are you? Are you an herbivore, a carnivore, or an omnivore? Most of you in the room are omnivores. Most of you in the class, I don't know if you're in the room, most of you in the class are omnivores. Some of you are herbivores if you're a vegetarian. Most people on the planet are herbivores. Meat is hard to come by on the planet, so most people are eating just vegetables. All right, there is a 4th class of consumers or heterotrophs called detrivores. Detrivores are feeding on the waste of an ecosystem like a vulture. So dead things, they're eating dead things. Trivia question: why do scientists believe that vultures have bald heads? It's a mutation that they think is beneficial to vultures because vultures are sticking their heads into rotting carcasses. If they had feathers on their heads the way other birds do, the feathers would get gummed up with guts and blood in this way, and the birds are not able to wash their heads. They don't have hands or any way to wash off their feathers. So this way the birds don't have that sticky, gross, rotting, disgusting mess stuck to their heads. All right, now there's one more group of consumers that fit under the class of detrivores, and they're called decomposers. So the decomposers are a class of detrivores that include bacteria and fungi. They break down dead tissue and waste into simpler molecules. So it's not the same as a vulture that's just eating dead tissue. These are things that are actually breaking it down into simpler molecules, and then they return some of those molecules to the soil to be reused by autotrophs. So the bacteria and the fungi in the pictures are breaking down these dead trees and returning nutrients back to the soil, which keeps the soil fertile so that new plants can grow in place of the plants that died. Okay, now switching gears, we're going to talk about the relationship between producers and consumers, or the other words, remember, were autotrophs and heterotrophs, the relationship between them. When one organism eats another organism, the energy from that organism is transferred to the one that's doing the eating. Energy flows up this pyramid. It flows from the producers, which are on the bottom level, up to the consumers. A trophic level is the level of the organism in its relation to the energy transfer chain. So the lowest trophic level always includes producers because they're the ones that are making the energy in the first place. And then in the diagram above, the herbivores are the ones that are on the second trophic level, and then the carnivores, the ones that are eating the herbivores, would be on the third trophic level. Okay, a couple additional terms that you're probably already familiar with. The food chain is something that we've kind of talked about already. It's a path of feeding relationships, and a food web is all of the different food chains in a given ecosystem. Now, we've got a food web on the diagram here, but food webs are infinitely more complex than this one is. This is grossly oversimplified just for teaching purposes. So if you take a look at anything on there, you can see who eats whom. Imagine that the arrow, sometimes students get confused on who's eating whom. So imagine the arrow is pointing into the mouth of the organism. So that tells you what direction the food is going. So for example, you see the moth and the frog. The arrow is going from the moth to the frog. So imagine that that moth is going in the mouth of the frog. So you know that the frog is the one that's doing the eating. So the frog is eating a dragonfly, it's eating ants, but it is being eaten by kookaburras. So in this diagram, who are the detrivores in this food web? And in that case, decayed material down at the bottom is being eaten by daphnia, centipedes, and bacteria. So those are the detrivores in that particular food web. Okay, here's a quick, important little statistic that scientists often throw out. It's an approximation, it's not a precise number, but roughly, and this is interesting because it's a small percent, roughly 10% of the energy of one trophic level is transferred to the next level of consumers. So look at the bottom level of the diagram there. Producers have this enormous amount of energy. There are so many plants on the planet, and yet the number of herbivores is comparatively tiny. And that's because the transfer of energy from the producers to the herbivores is so small. There's very little energy that's getting transferred. Look at the number of squirrels in your yard, in our backyard, whatever, compared to the number of trees and the amount of grass that's growing. Very few herbivores. And now try to imagine how many lions there are in the world, or how many bald eagles there are in the world, how many of those large or small carnivores there are. Very, very few are supported because only 10% of the energy of the previous level is getting transferred, and so you can't have very many organisms at that top level. So the question is, why? Why is only 10% of that energy ever getting passed on? Well, there are four main reasons that the energy is not getting passed on efficiently, that only 10% of the energy from one level is being passed on. First of all, some organisms are never eaten. So trees are not being eaten all the time, or not all parts of a tree are being eaten. So the energy that the trees have stored inside them isn't getting passed on to the next level. When a tree dies, the nutrients are being returned to the soil, and the producers are reusing that energy. But it's not being passed on to the next level of the herbivores. Some organisms, not some organisms, all organisms use up most of the energy that they make or eat for themselves. They use up all their energy. They use it for cell respiration to make their energy, to make their ATP. They use up their energy when they move, when they hunt. They use it maintaining body temperature or to reproduce. Only a small amount of the energy that they take in is stored. So when they get eaten, there's not very much energy inside. So imagine a mouse. A mouse is eating seeds all day long. It's feeding and feeding and feeding and feeding, but it's scurrying and scurrying and mating and taking care of babies and doing all kinds of things and keeping its body warm. So when an owl comes and eats that mouse, very little of the food that the mouse had eaten in its entire life was actually stored inside that mouse's body. Most of it has been burned away with the mouse's activities. So that mouse has very little energy inside of it that the owl can use. In addition, the digestive process of animals is inefficient, so energy is wasted. When that owl eats that mouse that does not have very much energy in it in the first place, some of you may be familiar with owl pellets, the owl isn't able to digest the bones and it's not able to digest the fur. So all the energy that was stored in the bones and the fur gets wasted. And oh, I guess that was the last one. So how does this affect the fact that only 10% of the energy gets passed on? How does this affect the number of organisms at each level? And the pyramid kind of indicates that. All right, how is that the fact that just 10% of that energy is being passed on from one level to the next? Let's take a look. If you go on safari, for example, in Kenya or Tanzania, you will see about 1,000 zebras, gazelles, wildebeest, and other herbivores for every one lion or leopard you see. And there are far more grasses, trees, and shrubs than there are herbivores. There's an enormous amount of energy at the producer level, at the lowest trophic level. As you move up to the next level, very little of that energy. Not all the plants get eaten. The herbivores have inefficient digestive systems and they use a lot of the energy themselves, so very little of that energy gets transferred on. All right, now to wrap up this screencast and to get you to really think about the implications of that 10% fact, think about it. In theory, if humans wanted to use our food supplies in the most efficient way, should we be carnivores, herbivores, or omnivores? Think about it. What would be most efficient? It turns out being herbivores, not omnivores. Most students will say omnivores. Being herbivores is most efficient. When we eat animals, animals are on the second trophic level. Cows, for example, they are herbivores and they're on the second trophic level. They have already eaten plants. They have wasted tons and tons of energy just walking around, letting their hearts beat, chewing food. They waste all this energy. They poop out some of the food that they eat. If instead of eating cows, we ate the crops and the plants themselves and didn't go through the cow, we could survive on much, much less food. So there are a lot of scientists who think that to support as large a human population as we're going to need to support, humans are going to need to get more and more away from eating meat and turning more and more to being herbivores. All right, that's it.